Welcome to Monograph Matters. I'm talking today with Amanda Roy, author of the SRCD Monograph on place-based developmental research, conceptual and methodological advances in studying youth development in context. This discussion focuses on time and space. Amanda, can you discuss how time and space or place are connected?
Yes, thank you. So in working on this monograph and this chapter in particular, we really emphasized the fact that aspects of time, place, and culture, as researchers, we really need to think about them as intersecting dimensions. And so oftentimes past research has really focused on one or the other, and we really think that to push this area of developmental research forward, we really need to think about the complex ways that these elements are interconnected. And so I won't go into all of the ways that this can happen, but one of the things that we talk about in the chapter is the intersection between time and space. And so as developmental researchers, we've talked a long time about developmental transitions, which really focus on time and how young people go through periods where they're transitioning from one developmental period to another. So for example, from middle childhood to adolescence. And there's decades of research around how these periods of transition can be disruptive in many ways for young people's development. So in our chapter, we push this idea to think about this intersection between time and space in terms of ecological transitions. And ecological transitions can be thought of as the ways that individuals or periods of time when individuals are transitioning between different types of places. So in some ways, this can overlap with developmental transitions. So in terms of the transition from middle childhood to adolescence, we can think of the ways that what that means in terms of transitioning to a new school, transitioning to a new group of peers, potentially transitioning to a new neighborhood space where you go to school. So in that way, we can think about both this intersection between time and also ecological space. We also think it's important to think about that they're not necessarily solely connected to shifts in developmental period. So for example, you could also think about an ecological transition in terms of being brought on with a change, some other sort of change in a young person's life. So for example, if a family moves, this may mean a whole new set of neighborhoods, friends, school that will be associated with this ecological transition. At the same time, it may be brought on with a shift in one's own interests. So if an individual becomes interested in a new sport, a new activity, it may lead them to new places that they wouldn't have been experiencing previously. And so in many ways, this intersection of space and time overlaps nicely with this idea of activity space that other authors will be talking about. And we just really hope to emphasize the fact that sort of thinking about where these intersections happen between these elements of time, space, and culture can really push our thinking and understanding in terms of thinking about how these elements shape individual development.
So Amanda, how do you incorporate this notion of time connected with space or places at different scales in your work? Or what can others do in their work to seriously consider time and space as inextricably linked?
Thank you. So in this work that we are doing, we're really interested in emphasizing the intersections between time, space, and culture. So prior work, other researchers have definitely explored each of these elements individually. We're arguing that they really need to be brought together to fully understand and move the field of developmental science forward. So in one way that I attempt to do this in my own research is that I have led a study of young people. It's a longitudinal study of young people living in Chicago. And several years ago, I became really interested in pushing this understanding of how young people experience place, and also what does exposure to environmental characteristics look like. So to explore this further, I recruited a sample of 40 young people living in Chicago to carry GPS-enabled cell phones for a 1-week period. And over this period of time, they were continuously collecting information on where young people spent their time. But young people are also responding to prompts 5 times a day around what they were doing, who they were with, and their attitudes and mood in that moment. And what this allowed us to do, so after we collected this data, we were able to integrate it with publicly available data on different environmental characteristics. And so we did a case study using locations of crime to really explore how you could think about what exposure looks like, what exposure means for young people. And so we merged on all of the instances of crime, their locations that occurred within the same period that we were collecting GPS data from the young people in our sample. And so what this allowed us to do was really think and explore different parameters around what does exposure to crime mean. So typically when people have done work on this in the past, when they look at exposure to crime, it tends to center on one particular location. So for example, the home and a parameter around the home. So for example, 660 feet is something that we've used, which is about a city block in Chicago. And then the number of crimes that occur around that child's home, around that individual's home within a set period of time. So for example, within a year. And the problem with this approach is that it really doesn't take into account the ways that young people navigate through space, the way that they engage with space, and where they spend their time. So by using the GPS data, we were able to explore how often young people came into contact with locations of crime throughout the city beyond sort of their immediate neighborhood. And we were able to create these different parameters in terms of spatial and temporal filters. So when we think of it, traditionally, when I think of exposure to something, it means coming into contact with something in a given moment within a given place. However, when you're thinking about exposure to environmental neighborhood characteristics, oftentimes that becomes a little bit more amorphous. So we explored sort of different spatial parameters. So when a young person came within 660 feet of a crime, but also looking at more narrow parameters as well. And then also thinking about different spatial or different temporal parameters. So you can think about, a direct exposure being that you're in the same place when something happens. But with crime, you can also think about, does the influence of being in a location where a crime happened, sort of what is the period of influence? Does it last for an hour, 5 hours, 24 hours? So that's what we were really looking at. We were able to look at these different filters of both time and space and see what that meant for the overall number of exposures to crime that young people experienced, but also estimating, using those different parameters to estimate relationships to outcomes. And what we were finding, as not surprisingly, that when you think about exposure to crime in this much more dynamic way, young people are experiencing crime across the city at a much higher level than when we're thinking about it just within the neighborhood or within the residential boundary. At the same time, we were seeing that sort of when we were estimating relationships, that the relationships we were seeing seemed to be strongest within the 5-hour window and for the outcomes that were most immediate. So when young people were telling us their feelings in the moment, those relationships were stronger than relationships with more static characteristics. And so to summarize and to really sort of think about how others may take this information and how we collectively can push the field forward, I think it's really important for us to start thinking about what does exposure to environmental characteristics mean? What is the underlying mechanisms that are happening that are driving the way that how we experience space shape us as individuals? How do we perceive those exposures? And thinking through the potential that different types of exposures might have different types of meaning for young people's outcomes. So these immediate sort of shocks or in the moment exposures might be salient for sort of one's mood, but things that are about exposures that happen over time that are accumulated might be the ones that we really need to think about in terms of long-term consequences for individual development. So just thinking along those domains in terms of how researchers can think about these intersections and really encouraging people to think through what are those underlying mechanisms that may be driving the types of relationships that we see.
Read more about this topic in the monograph issue, Place-Based Developmental Research, Conceptual and Methodological Advances in Studying Youth Development in Context, by Witherspoon, White, Bámaca, et al. If you like this video, consider watching our Monograph Matters playlist. For additional resources related to this and other issues of the monographs of the Society for Research in Child Development, please visit monographmatters.srcd.org.